B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, April 4th, 2018. We'll honor Dr. Martin Luther King on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of his state-sponsored killing. Coming up near the end of this podcast. Well, in the last 24 hours, many Americans are learning some of the legal lingo related to the special counsel's investigation, Robert Mueller. And the Washington Post is reporting, without any attribution of exactly where they got this information, that Robert Mueller, in meeting last month with lawyers for Donald Trump, communicated that at this time, Trump is not the target of the Mueller investigation. He is a subject. Now, this has led to quite a bit of speculation. We're going to cover the two key angles on this. But I find it fascinating. The Washington Post is deeply invested in the Trump-Russia narrative, together with the New York Times and many cable news outlets. They have been promoting this whole narrative. It's a meme based on anonymous leaks, on information and evidence that is not available for the public to see. And they've created a narrative that they think, is the truth. And much of this, of course, is based on a real decline in journalism, where they are reporting things that often cannot be proven. So the headline in today's Washington Post, in an analytical piece about this news, reads, Mueller told Trump he's not a criminal target in the Russia probe. That may not mean what you think. So, this is consistent with what I've heard from other commentators who are invested in the Trump-Russia story. And that is, they think that Mueller may be playing Trump by saying, hey, you don't have anything to worry about. Sit down. Let's do an interview. And, of course, one of Trump's top lawyers quit 2 weeks ago after he told, his name is John Dowd, after he told his friends that Trump wasn't listening to him. And it appears that what Trump wasn't listening to was whether or not he should submit to a session with Mueller and his investigators. And, of course, if I were Trump's attorney, I would tell him, no way. You are such a pathological liar and a guy who steps on his own lies that this is a very bad risk, Mr. Trump, and I cannot counsel that you pursue that strategy. Well, the other attorneys were told, Ty Cobb and Jay Sekulow, have persuaded Trump that he should submit to an interview with Mueller. So one of the theories here, promoted by the people who promote the Trump-Russia story, is that the wily special counsel and former FBI director is laying a little trap for Trump here. And he could be telling a white lie because he believes that under the precedents that he cannot actually indict a sitting president. And it is an area that would be subject to litigation if Mueller did actually indict Trump for obstruction of justice or any other significant crime. Trump would immediately appeal that. It would be tied up in the courts for 18 months to 2 years, in my estimation. So Mueller appears to be conceding that he either can't or should not indict a sitting president. So that's the theory that is advanced by some of the people who believe, that Trump is guilty of collusion with Russia, that Russia hacked the DNC, gave it to WikiLeaks, and tilted the election against Hillary Clinton. So I find that an interesting line of thinking. Then there's one other document that I want to introduce for your consideration here. Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General who oversees the Mueller investigation, released a memo that's heavily redacted. It was released on Monday night. And this memo, at least what remains that we can read, shows that Mueller was authorized in a memo that was delivered on August 2nd of 2017 to expand the investigation to include Paul Manafort and his money laundering, tax evasion related to the millions of dollars that he was paid by the Ukrainian leader Viktor Yanukovych, who was taken down in an American-backed coup. Now, what's fascinating about this, consider the date, the memo, August 2nd of 2017. It was during the last week of July of 2017 that Bob Mueller's goons arrived pre-dawn at Paul Manafort's house, and they conducted a no-knock raid. I can't justify that. And the timing here is of concern, because it appears that Mueller used the authority before it was officially given to him. You might say, well, gosh, it was just a couple of days, who cares? But these are legal issues that can really determine the outcome of a potential trial down the road. Now, there's a whole other interpretation of this news that the Washington Post attributes to the Mueller investigation. And Jonathan Turley is a Washington-based law professor who I have great respect for. And in a piece that he published today at The Hill, I've linked to it in the show file for this podcast. He talks about denial. The Kubler-Ross stages can be a long road toward acceptance. And he says that a weird form of Kubler-Ross seems to have taken hold of the American media. Rather than refusing to accept indicators of impending death, many journalists and analysts seem incapable of accepting signs that the Trump presidency could survive. And Turley writes, after a year of being assured that bombshell developments and smoking gun evidence was sealing the criminal case against Trump, Mueller told the White House that he is not considering Trump to be a target, but only a subject. And Turley says the dissonance is too great for many who refuse to accept the obvious meaning of this disclosure. He continues, Mueller at this time apparently does not believe Trump meets the definition of a target or a person as to whom the prosecutor or the grand jury has substantial evidence linking him or her to the commission of a crime, and who, in the judgment of the prosecutor, is a putative defendant. Turley goes on, that Mueller does not believe there is substantial evidence linking Trump to the commission of a crime would seem to merit some recognition. However, there's been a disturbing lack of objectivity in the coverage of this investigation. You think so? You got that right, Professor. Throughout it, some of us have cautioned that the criminal case against Trump was far weaker than media suggested. Fired FBI Director Comey himself told Congress that Trump was not a target of an investigation before he got fired. Now, this does raise some questions for me because, as I've told you, I believe that Trump is impeachable. Impeachment is a political act. It requires provocation and some basis. But I believe his clear obstruction of justice in firing Comey, dictating the memo about Don Jr.'s meeting with the Russians, and many other moves, including asking Comey before he fired him to go easy on Mike Flynn. And I'm not sure why Turley doesn't see some merit in the obstruction of justice issues. So, and let me read this comment from Turley as well. He says, in February, Mueller handed down indictments of 13 Russian nationals and 3 Russian organizations for election-related crimes from hacking to identity fraud. Not only did these charges not implicate Trump or his campaign, but the filing expressly stated that no one in the Trump campaign knowingly engaged Russians in these efforts. Looking at each of the prior filings, the disclosure would seem consistent with a lack of compelling evidence of a crime by Trump. Turley continues, the obvious point is that after months of investigating Trump, Mueller still does not have sufficient evidence to make him a target. True, he says, a subject can become a target, but that is not clear at this point. And he also says that if Mueller is using this as a way to try to seduce or trick Trump into the interview or a deposition, that would be a foul play on the special counsel's part. So for me, this shows that the frenzy that has consumed our media for more than 18 months now may end up just being a poof of dust. Mueller says he's going to submit a series of reports about his findings from this investigation. And we've seen that the Vander's Wall, or whatever his name is, got 30 days in jail for lying. And as I've pointed out, there's plenty of corruption around Trump and the cronies that he's recruited. But the central argument or accusations of the Trump-Russia narrative remain unproven. And that bothers a lot of people because they have just been buying into it, believing that this is going to lead to the ejection of Trump from the White House. And here we are in March, with the midterm elections in November. And with the exception of a few lefty Democrat outliers, is anybody talking about impeachment? Is that a reason to give the House back to control of the Democrats and make Nancy Pelosi Speaker again? I believe there's a strong case for that. But the Democrats look at the polls and they say, oh, we might have some defections in red states that we weren't going to win anyway. So I think that many of the people who are deeply committed to the Trump-Russia narrative and believe that it was going to lead to his departure from the White House in one means or another, I think they have been sadly and tragically misled. Interesting poll was released on Monday by Monmouth University, and it relates to what Americans know and how they feel about the so-called deep state. And first, the astounding results. 59% of Democrats, 59% of Republicans, 62% of independents agree that appointed officials hold too much sway in the federal government. Now, the mechanics of the poll worked this way. Only 13% of Americans say they are very familiar with the term deep state. Another 24% are somewhat familiar, but two-thirds say they're not familiar with the term. But when it's described as a group of unelected government and military officials who secretly manipulate or direct national policy, 74% believe this type of apparatus exists in Washington. Only 1 in 5 say it does not exist. And I've used the term deep state. I kind of dialed back on it because there's so many different interpretations of it. But I do believe that we have a permanent government that greets the electeds who come and go, and they either tell them what to do or they find ways to force them to do what the shadow government, the deep state, wants. So I find this interesting, and I have linked to the article about this by Mike Whitney in the UN's Review. Take a look. That caravan that has scared the shit out of Donald Trump led him to the frenzy, threatening to send American soldiers to the southern border to prevent these unarmed asylum seekers, mostly from Honduras, from reaching our border. Well, it turns out that the caravan is fizzling, and they are hundreds, if not more than 1,000 miles south of the U.S. border. They are currently in Oaxaca State, and the group is kind of splintering. The caravan that once had about 1,150 or more people has stopped in the town of Matias Romero in Oaxaca. And the leaders say the idea was never for this group of people to reach the border. It was more to achieve a sensible and clear solution to migrants' need to leave their countries. So maybe all this will fade. Trump says all kinds of things that never come true. He says things and then turns around and contradicts himself 24 hours later. But yesterday I raised questions about the status of posse comitatus, the law that originated in the administration of Rutherford B. Hayes, that prohibits the deployment of regular military to enforce domestic laws. And our friend Carol Schuler posted a great article on Facebook that I grabbed. It's written by Elie Mystal. And Mystal is a legal analyst. He's executive editor of Above the Law. I have linked to his screed, and it's very entertaining and just a little bit edgy. He says, I don't expect that Trump understands that law or cares why it's there. He's pissed that Ann Coulter didn't send him an Easter card, and so he's blurting random untrue things about immigrants again. He seems to be under the impression that there is some kind of caravan of brown people bearing down on us from Mexico. Then he quotes a political report. Trump said on Tuesday he intended to deploy troops along the U.S.-Mexico border. And what's this guy's name again? Mystal. Sorry. Mystal says, yes, that is the President of the United States boasting about his intention to violate posse comitatus while speaking to leaders of former Soviet republics. When reached for comment, the Manchurian candidate said, it appears I'm not needed here. Mystal continues, the bitch of it is, this might not be a slam-dunk violation of the Posse Comitatus Act. There's at least a legitimate claim that using the military as a human wall to prevent foreign nationals from entering the country is not an enforcement of domestic policies. He says one can imagine, for instance, the president stationing troops along the border in preparation for an invasion into Mexico. That would not be a violation of Posse Comitatus. And he says you can also argue that since 9/11, Posse Comitatus is a dead law walking. We know that our military is engaged in all kinds of activities on domestic soil, mainly under the guise of protecting us from terrorism. We know this because occasionally they get busted for doing it. So I find this a very useful and fun read, and I hope you'll take a look, and I think, will have a better understanding of Posse Comitatus than Trump does. Also, it's important to note that the Pentagon spun Trump's statement as saying, well, what he means is he's going to mobilize the National Guard. And over the past 20 years, California, under Governor Wilson, sent National Guard troops near the border. Obama even deployed some National Guard troops near the border. But it turned out they couldn't do much. They can't supplant the Border Patrol. They can't arrest people. They can't go into Mexico. And so they ended up just doing odd jobs along the border, fixing fences and putting up some technical, scanners and other surveillance devices. But it's all for show. And it's a waste of time and money. Now, Trump has instructed the Pentagon to prepare to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria. He hasn't set a date for that, and he doesn't indicate that he's going to send those troops from Syria to the Mexican border. But he said that the U.S. mission in Syria will not extend beyond the destruction of the Islamic State, and that's another way of saying that Assad will stay, and the U.S. is accepting that. In a statement this morning, the White House said the military mission in Syria is coming to a rapid end. The Islamic State is almost completely destroyed. The U.S. and our partners remain committed to eliminating the small ISIS presence in Syria that our forces have not already eradicated. But there are other considerations here. And let me be very clear, I don't believe that American troops ever belonged in Syria. So I welcome a good decision by a bad president. But Trump excoriated Obama for what he said was the premature withdrawal of most American forces from Iraq. And that, of course, is when Obama reluctantly executed George W. Bush's exit plan from Iraq. He tried desperately to get the Iraqis to let us leave more troops there, and when that didn't work out, he just accepted that and went forward with Bush's exit plan. And in this article in the Washington Post, they wait till the very end to talk about Turkey. Now, Turkey and Russia will grow in influence in Syria if the U.S., in its overt mode, departs. But Trump isn't saying anything about getting all our covert operatives out of Jordan and neighboring countries, and so we don't have a complete picture. But General Votel said that the effort to remove remaining pockets of Islamic State fighters has been slowed in recent weeks because members of the U.S. proxy force fighting on the ground, the Kurdish-dominated Syrian Democratic Force, had left the fight to join fellow Kurds fighting against Turkey in the northwest, along the Syria-Turkish border. And this is a complication that has been compounded by the announcement yesterday that Turkey is building a nuclear power plant with help from Russia. Turkey is clearly moving more into the Russian influence orbit than the NATO-US. And I'm not making these arguments to suggest that we should leave troops in Syria. It's just that you never get the idea that Trump has an understanding of the full picture. He's just reacting emotionally and impulsively. And that is always quite dangerous. His impulsive launch of the trade war with China is showing some real problems. Yesterday, China hit back $50 billion worth of tariffs on American soybeans, automobiles, chemicals, and other goods. Moving with unusual speed, Chinese officials outlined plans to make it more costly to import 106 types of American goods into China. Now, to put this in context, the tariffs that have been imposed on each side really are for show. Neither set of tariffs will go into effect right away. We don't even have a clear plan of that. And the tariffs that the United States has announced account for about a third of China's American imports. That means 2/3 are unscathed by these tariffs. And on the flip side, I saw a figure here that about 1/9 of China's exports to the United States are going to be tagged with tariffs. Yesterday, as I sat down behind the microphone here, I saw the news alerts, the breaking news about the shooter at YouTube's headquarters in San Bruno. That's on the peninsula south of San Francisco and very close to SFO, if you know where the airport is here. The attacker who killed herself is identified as Nasim Agdam, and she wounded 4 people before she killed herself. She's described as in her late 30s, lived in Southern California, spent a lot of time on YouTube creating videos in English, in Turkish, and in the Iranian language. She is an immigrant from Iran, and she was angry at YouTube because they had censored some of her videos. They took her out of the payment plan. She was angry that one of her videos only earned her 10 cents. And I consider this to be a minor story in the scheme of things. That's kind of sad in and of itself. But it's always interesting to see which of these incidents draws the attention of the tweeter-in-chief. And famously last week, Sarah Huckabee Sanders said that Trump doesn't get involved in local cases like the Sacramento shooting of an unarmed black man by 2 cops. But perhaps he thought that since this woman is from the Middle East, she's likely a Muslim, and so he had to weigh in. YouTube, of course, is owned by Google. And down the road at the Googleplex in Mountain View, thousands of employees there, 3,100 to be exact, have signed on to a petition urging the company not to pursue a contract with the Pentagon to use what they call machine learning or artificial intelligence for warfare technology. And Sundar Pichai, CEO of Google, said, "We believe that Google should..." The petition addressed to him says, "We believe that Google should not be in the business of war." It asked that Google pull out of Project Maven, a Pentagon pilot program, and announce a policy that it will not ever build warfare technology. Now, what's fascinating is that just after I read this story this morning, there was a little commotion outside, and I went to see what it was. And one of the Google cars that has this big, 360 camera device mounted on a post that's mounted on the roof of the car had been in the parking lot of our building here. And the car was identified with markings that showed it is from Street View, the Google service where you know how it works. You can look up an address and you see what it looks like from the street. But why do they have to go in the rear parking lot? I mean, there's ice cream back there, okay? One of the other tenants in this building, they have a big ice cream freezer. They haven't offered me any. At any rate, the Google car was here. And I find this interesting because these Google employees must not know of the origins of Google Earth. And it's Yasha Levine, the author of Surveillance Valley, who first informed me of how Google Earth was developed under an exclusive contract with one of those 17 intelligence agencies that you've never heard of, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. So Google has been deeply involved with the Pentagon for many years now, and while I support the activism and the advocacy of these Google employees, I don't expect it to do much. Mark Zuckerberg is going to testify next week about Facebook, the data, the Cambridge Analytica situation, and I guess whatever else they ask him about. He'll testify before the House Energy and Commerce Committee on April 11th, and he is also expected to entertain the Senate Judiciary Committee. Every day I pause for a second and thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And I hit the post office box yesterday. As always expected on the first of the month, Paul Elsesser kicks in a very nice check. I got a renewal and extra cash from Keita Tom in Corvallis, Oregon. She's been listening and supporting for years now. Dear Peter B., thank you for the great podcasts and interviews. Thank you, Keita. And Josh Cisco checks in from just around San Jose. He's in Santa Clara. And he said, "I'm renewing my annual subscription that my wife got me for my birthday last year. I am not dissuaded by your contrarian views and musings in the slightest." Well, hey, Josh, I love that. He does have a humble request from for the humble host. Any way we could hear a little more news on Syria, Yemen, and Puerto Rico. All right, I will keep it in mind, do my best to address those subjects. You want to become a subscriber? Come on over to peterbcollins.com. I need your support. You pull on the menu button, then click on Become a Subscriber. You land on the sign-up page where you've got choices, $5, $10, $20 a month, the $50 annual subscription. Well, on Monday, here in the podcast, I talked about James Corbett's hour and 38-minute video response to the Newsbud video that came out, I guess, a couple of weeks ago. And James Corbett did a great job of exposing what I consider to be smear tactics used by Sibel Edmonds on the reporters Eve Bartlett and Vanessa Beeley. And I don't know the work of these two individuals in the greatest detail, and I made a mistake. And Spiro Skouras dropped me an email this morning. In your report, you stated Sibel and Newsbud attacked Rania Khalek. This is false. If you listened to our report, you would understand we were actually defending Khalek, as well as Max Blumenthal, who both came under vicious attacks from Beeley and Bartlett. Well, Spiro, I accept your correction there, and I hope we have set the record straight. Now, in today's show file, I'm also linking to the Newsbud video response to James Corbett's piece, and I find it pretty lame. They use the word hypocrite about a dozen times, trying to lower the boom on Corbett. And one of the kind of tit-for-tat things that occurred is that in Corbett's video, to make the point that Sibel was smearing people using a kind of guilt by association for the fact that people have appeared on a specific media outlet or published in a certain place. And I think that it was misguided spin. Because Corbett, in order to illustrate his point, used a clip of Sibel Edmonds appearing on an Alex Jones video podcast. And he was basically saying, that anybody can do this. Now, James should have mentioned, I think, in hindsight, that he too has appeared on Alex Jones' InfoWars programs. But it doesn't undermine the way he was trying to explain Sibel's use of these association tactics. And I think that the response, primarily from Spiro and with a brief statement from Sibel, really exposes the sad shift into smear reporting that Sibel and Newsbud have undertaken. And I invite you to take a look at this yourselves. There was a long series of comments under the Facebook post of the Newsbud response video yesterday. And John Schoeneboom, who is one of my Facebook friends, says that James, in his usual well-researched and matter-of-fact manner, clearly exposed Newsbud's inexcusable hit piece as absolutely riddled with shoddy or non-existent research, patently false claims, and a number of ethical breaches and demonstrable hypocrisy. Presumably, if Newsbud had an answer to any of that, it would have taken this opportunity to say so. The silence speaks as loudly as the irony of accusing others of betraying journalistic principles. And to cap it off with what has become Sibel's signature move, the "I know something dirty but I won't tell you" bit of cheap innuendo is just flat out disgusting. And what he's referring to is when Sibel comes on at the end of the Newsbud video, she says that she knows things about James, but she's not going to share them. And that is a really disgusting tactic. And I'll bet Sibel knows things about me that she thinks she could expose, and it might undermine my credibility or hurt the perception that people have of me. And as one of the three people in this group who has never appeared on an Alex Jones show, all I can say is, do what you're going to do. Speaking of Alex Jones, a 24-year-old man from Massachusetts, Marcel Fontaine, lives outside Boston, who has never been to Florida, has sued Alex Jones and InfoWars for $1 million in a defamation lawsuit because after the Parkland school shooting, InfoWars falsely identified Marcel Fontaine as the shooter in that incident. As I mentioned, it was 50 years ago today that Martin Luther King was gunned down in Memphis, Tennessee. I remember it pretty vividly. 1968 was just as challenging a year, at least at that time, as I think many people are experiencing now under Trump. Nixon had been elected president. Well, actually, he was being elected there in 1968, so the campaign was underway. Johnson had announced he was bowing out. Humphrey was the choice, even though there were several anti-war candidates who had much greater traction. And the story of who killed Dr. King has largely been covered up. There are a lot of misleading factors. But I've linked in today's show file to an interview I did with author Stu Wexler a few years ago on the book he wrote about the King assassination. You might find that interesting. I'm also linking to Cornel West's powerful op-ed published at The Guardian today. A couple of quotes. The major threat of Martin Luther King Jr. to us is a spiritual and moral one. King's courageous and compassionate example shatters the dominant neoliberal soulcraft of smartness, money, and bombs. His grand fight against poverty, militarism, materialism, and racism undercuts the superficial lip service and pretentious posturing of so-called progressives, as well as the candid contempt and proud prejudices of genuine reactionaries. King was neither perfect nor pure in his prophetic witness, but he was the real thing in sharp contrast to the market-driven semblances and simulacra of our day. And he makes the point. We now come to the 50th anniversary of his assassination, and we once again are met with sterilized versions of his legacy. A radical man, deeply hated and held in contempt, is recast as if he was a universally loved moderate. The neoliberal soulcraft of our day shuns integrity, honesty, and courage, and rewards venality, hypocrisy, and cowardice. To be successful is to forge a non-threatening image, sustain one's brand, expand one's pecuniary network, and maintain a distance from critiques of Wall Street, neoliberal leaders, and especially the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands and peoples. And one of the theories about the motive for taking out Dr. King was that he had expanded his commentary to become a sharp critic of the war in Vietnam. And as long as he was staying in his lane, so to speak, and focusing on civil rights, LBJ and the deep state at the time could kind of just let things go. But once he vividly and very articulately spoke out against the war in Vietnam, it does seem that he became an enemy of the deep state. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment. This podcast is given away free, and you're free to share it far and wide. We post it on YouTube, and when you visit there, click the subscribe thing, will you?
Trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling